So let's begin today with the topic. And the topic today is why I left the church temporarily. I mean, it was quite a few years, but I had to come back to the church because in the end, God is real. And my relationship with anything had nothing to do with God, okay? Anyway, let's get into this. It's a little bit for me because I know I don't want to mash toes. I don't want my brothers and sisters out there to attack or even think anything funny. Listen to the entire story. If you do have an opinion, listen to the entire story first. All right? I know I'm not alone. Anyway, so since I was a child in Ghana, I used to go to church. I started going maybe it might have been about 9 or so I was when I started going. Because my mother had left and gone to the States, as I said. She had came over here to the U.S. And my older sister was in the church. She was Catholic. And so one thing about her while we were living in the house, even though she wasn't my mom, she took the place of a mother role, right? And so her thing was everybody living in the house had to go to church, with the exception of my father. By the way, she couldn't mess with him. But I'm going to come back to him and tell you how I know God is real based on what happened to him. My father hated church, couldn't tell him nothing about church. He was one of those, everything was negative. Never mind, he was raised as a Catholic when he was younger. Leads me to believe there's a whole lot of reasons for him hating church, the reason that he did. But we're not going to get into that because this is my story. It's not his. All right. So anyway, so my sister used to take us to church. So when I leave and came to the States, she was left in Ghana. But I'd moved with an older brother who was in church himself. And most my siblings are all older. They're like 13, 14 years older. So they all could have taken on parental roles for me. But anyway, my older brother, he was living with us in that house, if you remember, the same one in Brooklyn with the 2 bedrooms. But anyway, so he was in church and I started going to his church. Now, mind you, my mother was not a church goer, but this woman, she sang her hymns and did all of those things in the house and would read her Bible in the house, but she was not a church goer. So the thing is, she would encourage me though to go to church. So once my brother had started going, I started visiting the same church that he would visit. And then when I got married and I moved off with my husband, when we moved back to the States, we were stationed overseas first. And then once we moved back to the States, we started going to church. We were stationed in California anyway, because he had a commander that was a Christian and he would invite us to church and we started going to church again. All right. So we got back into the church. Both myself and my husband were going to church as a family. So when we moved to Georgia, because we moved from California to there, we still continued going to church. My husband left the church when he started getting involved the wrong way in adulterous affairs. And when we had first moved to let me just stop and put this in. When we had first moved to Georgia, everybody said, watch your husband, watch your man. These women here would steal. And I would laugh and tell my husband about it. Lo and behold, it ended up happening to him with somebody in the job. But that's a side story. So anyway, I started going to this church. And believe it or not, we started going to a Methodist church when we got here because it was the closest church to the house in Georgia. And one day my husband came home and told me, he said, look, I heard about this pastor when he was going to school because he had gotten out of the military and he was taking advantage of his military education. And he said to me, he said, while I'm driving going to school every morning, there's a pastor that I listen to. He said, you've got to listen to this guy. He's so powerful. He brings the word so real, So he introduced me to this church that I started going, this big mega church that I started going to. And back in those days, we didn't have GPS. If you had the address at some place, you didn't have Google either. You had the address at some place. I can't even remember how you found out. You had to ask somebody, I think, because I think I'd end up asking people how to get to the church. Anyway, I remember going and I found the church and went to the church the Sunday, always took the children to church and joined this church. I was in church from the time I joined that church I was so fed spiritually from that church that I started going for years. It was until my children were in their adult teen, like 17, 18, was eventually, I think the last one, the 18-year-old, the baby, I'm sorry, she was 18 when we had stopped going because she had went off to the military. But when I tell you I got involved in church, I got involved in church. Used to go on Sunday, used to go on Wednesday, started participating in church, doing stuff in the church. I had just loved the church and loved being around the people of God. Anyway, so years later, I started to fizz out. As the children left, I myself started going through a depression. But church was there for me, and it was truly helping me, right? I didn't express it and share the church, which I probably should, but anyway. So here we are, and I'm in church this one Sunday. I was with one of my daughters as well, and this pastor said that. And the one thing I have to say to people: stop worshiping man, because if you worship man, then you can get sidetracked by what that man has done. And even though I wasn't worshiping man, I kind of had this greatest respect for my pastor. I truly did respect him. Well, one thing I always remember him saying is, if ever we feel that he's not doing what he's supposed to do according to the Bible, we can leave. I remember him saying that. That was probably like 2006 or, 1995 or 1996 he had said that, right? And I always held close to those words that he had said. And it happened a couple of times before where he would invite guest pastors to come, and they would preach something outlandish. And when I say outlandish, meaning talking about getting blessings and how you get blessings and that sort of thing. And sometimes I was a little disappointed with the service that they gave. Not that it wasn't an excellent service, but it always was tied to money at the end. And that was my concern. So anyway, this last one, as you call the straw that broke the camel's back, was this last one where there was an African pastor, and I think he had a church in England and all over. He was from Nigeria, I believe. But anyway, long story short, he did this whole thing. He talked about all the blessings and how the miracle stuff that God did him and how he started, which was kind of similar to how my pastor started. He started with a small church, and God blessed him, and it grew into an international church. Well, let me read back. At that time, I left the main church because the church grew so big. They started having small churches all over. You're still looking at the big Megatron when you go into the small church. That pastor is still preaching, but they were all breaking off because the church was so far. For example, when we first started going, I lived at one point at least 55 minutes to an hour, and I didn't care. I would go to church, still find myself in church Wednesdays and Sunday, because that's how much blessings I was receiving from the word. Anyway, so here I am, and we're in church, and this pastor comes and he preaches. I never forget, he said, if you give $249 within 24 hours, 24 to 48 hours, God is going to perform this big miracle in your life. And you know, sometimes you can get caught up in what's going on. I did not have the $249, so I didn't give $249. But there are a lot of people that give the $249. And the next week later, when I went back to church, I started speaking to a few people. Did anything happen? No. Nobody, no. And then the way that pastor said it, it was like, if you didn't get your miracles, it's because you didn't have faith. Now, one of the things that disappoint me with that, and let me stop this here before I go any further. This is a man that I truly respect, and I understand as human beings, everybody make mistakes, right? So I'm not criticizing him and damning him and so that's it, he's the worst preacher out in the world. No. But for me, where I was at my stage, it was one of those things that was like, I didn't need to hear something else again like that, right? So my disappointment was not, yes, it was in my pastor, but it was in the man even that came and preached, because it was kind of prostituting God out, is what I have to say, okay? Pay, and this is what he'll do for you. Now, this is not to deter anybody from church or anything of the sort. What I want you to do is pay attention to what your pastor is doing, and pay attention to any church that you're visiting. Listen to what they're saying, because there are great pastors out there, including this pastor. I think he's a fabulous pastor still. I mean, there's a couple of times when I think that as a man he's fall, but we've all done that, right? None of us is perfect, and any one of us, as Jesus said, who's without sin cast the first stone. So I'm not trying to criticize and tear him down. I'm speaking about what caused me to leave the church. So so that's what happened. So it was one of those things where I was already going through stuff, and I really got mad, and I said, I'm not going back. Well, I don't know if you guys remember me talking about going out and dancing and how I want to dance. And I think that's tied to it. I think I was looking for something, because I thought to myself, when I used to be dancing like that the most is when I was out of church. When I didn't have a place to go Sunday morning and worship. When I wasn't doing those things, that's what it was. So for years, I was away from the church. I even got upset because some things I heard, not only from my pastor, but from other pastors who would say, oh, Christians shouldn't play the lottery. But in the same breath, I'm hearing them saying, if you win, bring the money here to me. And by the way, I'm going to say something that might sound very controversial. That was one of my things, is that if God said, the wealth of the wicked is laid up for the righteous, and make playing the lottery legal, I don't see why a Christian can't play the lottery. If it's legal in your state, then it's not illegal, and you're not going excessive with it, is what I'm talking about. If instead of buying some McDonald's, you take that McDonald's money, or a fast food, I'm not just calling McDonald's, or restaurant food, buying something out, or buying that outfit, and you say, okay, I'm going to invest it in playing the lottery. Because the benefit of playing the lottery, by the way, is that you've just blessed children in your neighborhood, maybe even your child. Family member's child might benefit, because money goes towards helping the school and education. So if you didn't win, you still just contributed and helped. So that was my thing about that. I had a discussion, and that was something else as well, right? So when I heard a pastor say, oh, you shouldn't play the lottery, but if you win, bring the money here. Well, then what are you saying, right? You're either condoning or you're not. You're either saying it's not, but I understand, because you don't want people to get caught up in something. It's even like drinking. I don't drink, smoke, or do drugs. And I know y'all tired of hearing me saying that, but anyway, I have to say it. But at the same time, I wouldn't criticize somebody for doing it as long as they're not overdoing it. And that's the same thing I would say. If you're not taking your rent money, your mortgage money, your bills money, all of those things to play the lottery. And yeah, maybe you might invest a $5 here or something. I don't see why, when it's the big numbers, I don't see why a Christian can't do that. And I'm not ashamed. If you see me in the line standing, yes, I intend to share, right? Because as God said, the wealth of the wicked is laid up for the righteous. And yes, I do consider myself righteous, right? So anyway, so that's it. So that was my reason that I'd gone away from the church for a while. And then I realized my life that I had to start. And when I say that, I literally had broken it down to where, even though I would say my prayers at home, I wasn't really focusing on my belief the way that I should. It took a few things happening, including the death of my husband and other things happening, to bring me back to realize that God is God and he still sits on the throne, right? This is not a service. I'm just sharing something with you of what happened to me. And then gradually, piece by piece, I started to, right? I still haven't found a church home, but I say my prayers. I look at television, and I'm a part of a prayer partnership that's going, and I spend my time reading the Bible because I feel I can get my nourishment there, right? So, and that's for anybody, I tell you. Pray for your family all together. Whether or not you're a Muslim, you're a Christian, you're a Hindu, whoever you are, always keep praying for your family. And the reason I'll get to that is my father, who literally hated the church, hated anything to do with church. I would hear my father say, oh, those people, he would talk all these different things. Before he passed, maybe about 5-6 years before he passed, my father got saved and came to know the Lord. So when he died a saved man, going to church every Sunday. And if you know my father, for those of you who know my father, that in itself was a miracle. So that was it. All right.